Hello and welcome to the second day of this conference on imperial inequalities. Thank you for joining us. I hope you managed to be here yesterday too, which was a fascinating day. So yesterday we were primarily focused on the, I guess, more historical analyses of empire, including the role of tax and welfare. And there are a couple of highlights that I'd like to pull out. So the first panel really focused on the role of finance during empire, and there's some particular elements of that, including discussions about how land value came into the process and financial innovations around the creation of mortgages and how that contributed to various bubbles and crises of different sorts in a way that, in a sense, we've been experiencing globally ever since financial liberalization episodes, followed by uncontrolled economic booms and busts, which have tended to have, of course, fairly systematic effects in exacerbating inequalities. The second panel addressed more issues around concepts of charity alongside welfare during empire. And there's a lot in there about the ways in which we use charity, or charity has been used, as both a justification at the individual level for effectively personal enrichment during empire, but also a broader justification for the entire process of empire. We take over these lands because we can bring civilization, we can bring welfare with us, we can address their poverty. Indeed, the whole concept of poverty, as Julia McClure has worked on, being part of arguably a creation of empire and the partly religious justification for empire. And then we had our first keynote from Vanessa Ogle, looking at what really we can now see in hindsight was the first global wave of illicit financial flows. So this period after the kind of the brute force extraction of formal empire, as colonies began to gain independence and imperial actors looked around to see where they could take their ill-gotten gains without taking them back to the capital, as it were, where they might face taxation, instead looking at other further flung parts of the empire where, particularly smaller jurisdictions, where they might be able to influence the legal structures and so on in order to continue to protect those illicit flows. Now, I'll talk in a panel later about the third phase of tax empire that grew from that. But we have two great panels really coming up also, both looking in different ways at the more modern aspects of empire. So the first focusing on the legacies of empire, I guess, as they play out, including the conceptual and the practical creation of what we might call offshore. And then looking at the current policy agenda, including this very live question of reparations, both for slavery and for empire more broadly. But and as we go through that, I guess we're moving a bit from the more focused academic work that made up most of yesterday's agenda into a more policy-focused element, including looking at in the final panel a policy panel rather than presentation of papers. But I want to introduce today's keynote, and our speaker is Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla, who is a Senegalese development economist with great experience both in policy and in more academic research. So the perfect fit for the agenda that we have coming today. Now, he's worked as a technical advisor for the presidency of the Republic of Senegal and is currently based in Senegal, but he's now a research and program manager at the West Africa office of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. His publications and his research have covered a range of issues, including fair trade, labour markets, social movements, democratic theory, and economic and monetary sovereignty. A couple of major publications within that, one from 2014, The Fair Trade Scandal, Marketing Poverty to Benefit the Rich. And that's published by Pluto Press and Ohio University Press. And then coming out in February with Pluto Press, co-authored with Fanny Peugeot, Africa's Last Colonial Currency, the CFA franc story. And you know, those of you who are familiar with the CFA franc know it was created in the final phase of empire, if you like, in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, and it brought together 14 different African states split into 2 monetary zones. And the question being explored there, in a sense, is the extent to which that was directly the continuation of empire, and what the implications of it then and now were, why it was created, how it works, and what it's doing now. And I think that is likely to be part of what Dr. Sylla will share with us now, under the title of Colonial Macroeconomics, then and now. So realizing we are running slightly ahead, and that's really not against the spirit, let me just remind you, as people join us, feel free to use the chat to share comments, to introduce yourself, and you can see my colleagues have put the details of the program in there again if you don't have that to hand. But for formal questions that you'd like to put for the discussion, both in this keynote and in the panels to follow, please do use the Q&A, and we will pick them up from there. But with that, let me hand over to Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla to give us the keynote on colonial macroeconomics then and now. Please.
Thank you very much, Alex. Before reading my short presentation, I would like to thank all the organizers, Tax Justice Network, Gominda Bambra, and Julia McClure, and all their colleagues for this invitation to attend this fantastic virtual conference. My presentation has a provocative title, as Alex said, Colonial Macroeconomics, Then and Now. I've chosen this title in echo to a paper I co-authored with 2 of my colleagues, Koddenbrock from Gothenburg University and Ingrid Kvangraven from York University. And this paper is has a title named Beyond Financialization. And in this presentation, I will dwell on that research, connecting, let's say, the issue of financialization with how finance was practiced, let's say, during colonial times until now. Why this title, Colonial Macroeconomics, Then and Now? Because for those who have studied the history of colonial Africa through its fiscal and monetary dimensions, the similarities between colonial macroeconomics and neoliberal macroeconomics are striking. One might be tempted to see the neoliberal era as an avatar of colonialism. Actually, the main principles underlying the fiscal and monetary paradigm of the neoliberal era, sound finance and regressive taxation systems, central bank independence, and the direction of the credit system by oligopolistic banks were already applied in the European colonies, particularly in Africa. Yet, the insights from how finance operated in the colonial periphery seem to have escaped the attention of most researchers on money and finance. This is, for example, the case with the literature on financialization. In the paper I co-authored with Kai and Ingrid, we have tried to challenge the literature on financialization. Indeed, according to this literature, we have been living in a new era of capitalism, characterized by a historical shift in the finance production nexus. This thesis is based on 2 claims. First, finance has expanded to a disproportionate economic size. Second, and more importantly, finance has begun to behave abnormally towards the production and has divorced from legitimate economic pursuits. We call these claims the expansion and diverse meanings of financialization. The literature on financialization has produced innovative analysis, highlighted important trends, and documented in the detail the workings and extractive practices of global finance in the recent period. Despite its numerous merits, the literature suffers from two main limitations from our own point of view. First, except for the Marxian and Minskian accounts, it has put its empirical focus mostly on the last 4 decades. This short and selective historical perspective inadvertently helps to exaggerate the novelty of the macro-structural realities described under the concept of financialization. Actually, phases of financial expansion marked by the assertion of the power of finance have been characteristic of the long history of capitalism. This first critique is not intended to say that the present is just a repetition of the past and that there is nothing new under the sun. Our point is more modest. We just say that in order to detect continuities and shifts, a long-duration historical approach is necessary. The second and more profound limitation of the literature on financialization, a literature which is mainly produced in Anglo-centric knowledge centers, is that this literature has predominantly focused on core capitalist countries in Europe and the US, and has thus failed to work towards a fully global understanding of financial aspects of capitalism. The small proportion of research devoted to non-Western countries concerns the most important among them, and in particular, those classified as emerging economies, as in the works on subordinate financialization. Overall, the approach of this literature has often been to study the effects of the financialization of core countries on emerging economies, or to measure to what extent emerging economies are displaying similar features of financialization to those of the center. However, a focus on core countries, sometimes supplemented by a handful of emerging countries, does not suffice to grasp the trends, continuities, and shifts in the evolution of the capitalist system in total. For us, it is essential that the perspective be decentrate. Asking how the current financialization of core countries affects the global south is a legitimate question. However, our approach with Kai and Ingrid has been rather what a long-dual look at the finance production nexus from the perspective of peripheral countries can teach us regarding the realities currently described under the concept of financialization. In other words, the question we ask is, what can the long-dual observation of the deployment of finance in the global south can teach us about finance under imperialism, under capitalism? Our thesis is that the diverse understanding of financialization highlights nothing more than the normal and structural operation of finance in the long durée in the former European colonies in Africa. The emphasis in the literature on the novelty and the disruptive impact of financialization neglects how finance in the global south has been operating during the last 150 years. This neglect, from our point of view, reveals a lack of serious consideration for the relationship between finance and imperialism. It corresponds to what Radhika Desai calls, quote, an analysis of capitalism shown of imperialism, end of quote. To illustrate our thesis and at the same time point out the limitations of the literature on financialization, we make two major empirical counterclaims. One empirical claim in the literature on financialization is that financialization manifests itself in the shocking and new phenomenon of net transfer of resources from developing countries to developed countries. In other words, poorer countries are financing the rich countries rather than the other way around. For us, this phenomenon is not new and can hardly be described as a product of financialization, whatever the mean attached to the latter. Regressive net transfer of resources have been a structural characteristic of the functioning of the global economy since the colonial times until now. They were observed at least since the 19th century for Latin American countries. The same goes for Asia, especially India, and also for Africa. For example, the West African colonies of Britain transferred more wealth to Britain than they received from Britain. The view that Britain was a net exporter of long-term capital to its colonies is a myth, as some historians had documented. The reality is rather that colonies were long-term exporters of capital to Britain. This pattern of regressive net resource transfers did not end with the independencies in Asia and Africa. It still continues until now. So to claim that net resource transfers from the periphery to the core are a key manifestation of financialization, but also a 20th century phenomenon, illustrate from our point of view a lack of long durée point of view, as well as an ignorance of how finance operated under colonialism. The second and more important claim which we dealt with is the view that we are living since the last 4 decades a new era, marking a qualitative shift in the evolution of the capitalist system globally, where finance has diverged from production. Finance is considered to have stopped being the faithful servant of production. It now behaves autonomously with no regard for production and the needs of society. As for regressive net resource transfers, the divorce between finance and production cannot be considered to be a new phenomenon. Actually, the neglect of the needs of a self-centered economy has been the normal and structural operation of finance in most of the former European colonies in the global south during the last 150 years. To illustrate our point of view, we focused on the long-term study of the deployment of finance in two West African countries, Senegal and Ghana. We distinguished three periods: the colonial period, the dirigist period between 1960 and 1980, and the liberalization period starting from the 1980s until now. During the colonial period, the banking sector in both countries was essentially dominated by oligopolistic metropolitan banks, which were not interested in financing the domestic economy. Their role was rather to protect the metropolitan businesses from indigenous competition, to facilitate foreign exchange transactions, to grant short-term credits related to extractive sectors, and to export local savings to the metropolis. Even colonial administrators acknowledged at that time the limited and distorted contribution of the banking sector to the economic development of the colonies. As for merchant capital, especially in Senegal, it had no interest in diversifying into manufacturing or in spurring technological progress in the agricultural sector. Siphoning off the economic surplus from peasants was its dominant rationale. When they achieved their independences, respectively in 1957 and 1960, both Ghana and Senegal tried to domesticate finance. Ghana managed to some extent to indigenize further its banking sector to facilitate access to credit for Ghanaian businesses and to promote industrialization. By contrast, progress in decolonizing the monetary and banking structures was lower in Senegal, a country which obtained its independence conditional on legal agreements with France, requiring it to abdicate its sovereignty on many domains, including in foreign trade and currency management. Senegal, as even as a former French colonies, is still using a currency born during the colonial era and still under the legal control of the French treasury. Despite the creation of public banks, the Senegalese banking and financial sector remained foreign dominated during the dirigist period. Since the 1980s, Ghana and Senegal entered a period marked by financial liberalization under the aegis of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. This led to tighter prudential rules, banking rules, to the elimination of preferential interest rates, to a liberalization of interest rate ceilings. This process also led to the liquidation of public development and agricultural banks, as well as the privatization and denationalization of the banking sector in both countries. In contrast to the mainstream rhetoric that African countries are not financially open, data from the World Bank show that in the beginning of 2010, foreign banks controlled 94% of all total bank assets in Senegal. For Ghana, the figure is 57%. For the UK, a country considered to be financially very open, the comparative figure was only 14%. For Germany, it stood at 13%. The control of African banking sectors by foreign capital is reminiscent of the colonial period. There is, however, a major difference. For both Ghana and Senegal, the banking sector, while heavily foreign dominated, is no longer dominated by the banks from the former metropolis. In Senegal, for example, the influence of French banks has been eroded by the competition from Moroccan and so-called Pan-African banks. In other words, the control of banking assets has globalized. And this globalization of the Senegalese and the Ghanaian banking sectors did not alter their oligopolistic character and did not facilitate access to bank credit at affordable rates for the businesses and for the populations. From a long durée point of view, the cases of Senegal and Ghana demonstrate the remarkable continuation of foreign-dominated banking sectors and their lack of orientation towards financing domestic productive structures. Likewise, both cases show that even if foreign finance and its agents do not currently directly dominate, as in the colonial period, they still control the orientation of the latest economic development through policy conditionality, norm setting, and investment decisions. Indeed, for many countries of the global south, the priority currently being given to balanced budgets and to export-led growth, the overaccumulation of foreign exchange reserves in a context where their local resources are underutilized, the underfinancing of the real economy, all represents elements of continuity with the colonial period. Last but not least, the cases of Senegal and Ghana allow us to argue that only core economies, those having escaped the most vicious distortions brought by imperialism, can imagine that the normal operation of finance under capitalism is to support production. Instead, what we have been witnessing during the last decades is that globalized finance is somehow structurally behaving mutatis mutandis in some parts of the developed world as it used to in the periphery, that is neglecting the domestic economic's financial needs. In other words, if I were to be provocative, I would say with my co-authors that the developed countries were until now ignorant of how finance under capitalism really worked. With the growing perception of a diverse between finance and society's needs, they are currently discovering the real, albeit ugly face of finance under capitalism. An ugly face most countries of the global south are familiar with. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. That was great. Okay, and I have 100 questions, and also I can see some coming in on the Q&A. Do please, people, add further questions. But I want to ask you one in particular, which is sort of, I guess, a broader question. The way that you break down your time periods, arguably, in each phase, there's a kind of a shift depending on what's been happening in the colonizer countries. If, as you suggest when you finish there, we're entering a moment where people in the colonizer countries are kind of looking again at some of this. Do you see, I guess, an opportunity now to move out of the liberalization phase that you see from the 1980s, and what would it look like in the good scenario? If you could structure the new phase in such a way that it, at least, without kind of breaking in possibly with the past and the legacies that exist, what is the kind of the good scenario coming out of this, that's realistic but positive?
Well, I would say that the good scenario is not so likely. I'm not too pessimistic, but just trying to be, let's say, realist. Because if I take the case of the African continent, what is happening is that we are endogenizing, let's say, globalization, the financial aspects of globalization. The point of African elites is not to is somehow to escape, let's say, from foreign domination, but still to have a financial domination of, let's say, African ruling classes over the populations. So somehow that's how the system is currently working. For example, having less foreign domination, but having African capital sometimes coalescing with other capitals to impose the same extractive practices. And that's the trend we are seeing in the banking sector, which is no longer dominated by the former banks from the metropolis, but by Pan-African banks. But those so-called Pan-African banks are a mix of different capitals, capital from, let's say, some emerging countries, capitals from some African countries, etc. So the good scenario would be that the peoples themselves try to fight to have another kind of financial system which would be much more domesticated, for example, having popular banks, popular financial systems. But as I see for now, that's not the plan of African elites, unfortunately.
So look, picking up a question from the Q&A, Alexis Sewell has asked whether Ghana and Senegal have national banks, and perhaps just to build on that, whether you see positive opportunities in the form of state banking to address some of these issues, or if that also has its problems.
Yeah, in fact, in Ghana, there are the foreign domination of the banking sector is less pronounced than Senegal. In Senegal, I give the figure that in the beginning of 2010, 94% of foreign assets in the banking sector, of all total assets was foreign assets. So in Senegal, we do not really have banking, public banking. The state has shared in some limited proportion in some banks. In Ghana, there are much more possibilities for the state, but still there is no genuine effort to help the economy, let's say, have access to credit to affordable rates, because they are stick to the Washington consensus type of policies, trying to attract foreign direct investment, trying to attract other kind of foreign flows, and generally this require having high interest rates and so on. So it's a really difficult context for both countries and many African countries. And I think if they want to shine, that what is called delinking is really needed. But delinking is not only an economic project, but a political project.
Yeah. Okay, so another question coming in from Suming Ku, who says, thank you for this longue durée perspective on financing, which is a story of continuity of extractive financing without productive investment. However, the medium-term critical global perspective highlights the 1980s turn to a monetarist moment as a turning point for the reverse of productive investment versus extractive debt service. How does this narrative of continuity differ?
I did not really understand the question. Could you please repeat?
So I think, in a sense, asking, whether if we have a kind of monetarist moment in the 80s, and it's a turning point when we shift from a pattern of productive investment to one of extractive debt service. That's one view. In what you've set out, in a sense, there's more of a continuity that the financing is extractive all the way through. And so the question is asking about that difference, whether you don't see that monetarist turning point as significant, or if these are kind of parallel stories.
Yeah, I think the monetary turn in the 1980s is really significant because it somehow contributed to the so-called third world debt problem. Many countries in the global south, including Africa, borrowed, I don't say heavily, but borrowed it to some extent to finance their own development in the 1970s. And when the global interest rates increased and somehow coincided with the decline of their commodity prices, they could no longer service their debt. So they had to have recourse to the IMF and the World Bank to attenuate their balance of payments problems. And from there was the structural adjustment plans. And if you look at the reports, for example, of the World Bank about Senegal, they are saying that this has been really efficient, and we have been able to liquidate mostly all private banks, all public banks. And that was one of the aim of the structural adjustment plans. That means getting rid of public banks and promoting market-based finance. And this has been one of the aims. So this turning point is really important. But what we say is that the Dirigis period between 1960 and 1980s were a period where, following the enthusiasm created by decolonization, the governments tended to domesticate finance in order that finance be at the service of their economic development. And there has been an expansion, but relatively good expansion of credit, even if it has not been really used to spur development.
Turning to a kind of another angle of this, and perhaps looking to your new book, Roberta Hunter Henderson asks, would you agree that the imposition of the CFA and its associate conditions is the single biggest deterrent to development in former French West African colonies?
Well, when we say that, yeah, we attract a lot of criticism, because people might say you have corrupt government, they did not use well the CFA franc system because it has so many benefits, etc. I would just say that with this CFA franc system, there's no possibility of, let's say, controlled economic development. It's not possible. So I would not say that the CFA franc is responsible for the underdevelopment of the country using it, but I would say that it has a strong contribution to that state of affairs. And with the CFA franc, I do not see any country possibility managing to obtain social progress for its people.
On a different track, and this is sort of, I think, where the panels later today will go, Gominda Bambra has asked, how can we track the colonial drain of wealth when much of that was done by corporations, and so in some sense independent of colonial governments in the metropolis? But if we want to, to think about the scale of the extraction, have you kind of thought at all about, how we might do that? Thinking about the role of those corporations.
I think this is a very important question. And I want to stress one thing. Generally, people talk a lot about the debt issue, the sovereign debt issue in the soul. It's really important, and we have to tackle it in a systemic way. But for example, in Africa, the drain through, let's say, profit remittances are 5 times higher than the service of the external debt. People have to know that. In a previous paper we wrote with Kai and Ingrid, we have a graph where we showed that between 2000 and 2016, the debt service was 100 billion US dollar for 28 African countries, representing 85% of the GDP of Sub-Saharan Africa. While during the same period, profit remittances by transnational corporations amounted to 500 billion US dollar. That means 5 times more. And people generally do not talk about that. They just talk about the interest payment on debt. I think we have to tackle both aspects. So if we have to limit that drain, I think we have to have a program of what Sami Amin called delinking. And one aspect of delinking, because delinking is not autarky, delinking is just a program saying that we have to rebalance global relationships, that the domestic priorities of global south should be on the agenda when there is a conflict with the demands of the global system. And one way of operating this delinking is to domesticate finance. Finance has to be national. That means we have to rely more on funding in domestic currency, and we have also to have a better control over resources. So we need the two aspects: control over economic resources, but also financing to our best capability development in local currency. And what is important when we use the point of view of monetary sovereignty is that when countries have their own currency, they could fund with their own currency what is technically feasible in their own country. So we do not need foreign finance to do everything. What we could do in our own country, we could finance it using the resources of the monetary powers of the state.
I mean, related to that, I guess a lot of the work that we do is around the the degree of extraction in terms of profits and how that compares. And so the State of Tax Justice 2020 that we've just put out shows, on average, lower income countries losing 3 or 4 times as big a share of their current tax revenues to what's actually a pretty conservative estimate of corporate profit shifting. But that question of how you get control of that in a context when the international tax rules continue to be set by the OECD, which, despite its protestations, remains a club of the rich countries, I guess is one more aspect of how the underlying power structures behind this continue to reflect that imperial past, who has a voice in setting tax rules, whose multinational companies are largely being taxed or indeed not taxed, as the case may be. But this is perhaps an agenda of a bit later. Rather than me skipping over the Q&A, let me bring in one more question from there. So Wayne Green cites the work of Martin Core in the Third World Network, suggesting that maybe the key issues are lack of domestic economic capacity combined with weak social infrastructure, and with this being exacerbated by export prices and the servicing of debt and some of the policies around loans. And that in a sense you have countries that are starting from a much weaker position because they didn't develop their own rules around financial markets in the same way, and so we're sort of always behind what was being imposed. I don't know if that's how the question was meant, but I guess you could read that as saying, we'll never get out of this. That kind of having been on the back foot at the beginning is an impossible obstacle. But perhaps you can give us a more positive take on that. I mean, is there a way through?
Yeah, I think there is a way through, but we have to understand first what is possible and what is not. And something which is not possible is, for example, for developing countries, for the global south, to economically catch up with the global north. It's not, when I say that, I'm not pessimistic, is that given the resources we have, ecological constraints also, it's not possible, let's say, that the post countries in the world, like Niger, Central African Republic, will have their citizens have the same standard of living like people in the US, etc., because it's not ecologically sustainable. So when we realize that, we mean that we have to take another direction. And this other direction means that focusing on the real resources that the global south has at its disposition. I do not mean that international solidarity is not welcome. We need international solidarity, but we have to know that the idea of the developing countries catching up economically with the developed countries. This is impossible. It cannot be possible. That's what Celso Furtado called the myth of economic development. So we have to have another kind of orientation of development as I framed it. This alternative orientation of development, for me, is the program of delinking. We know catch up is impossible, but we could have fairer system in which everybody lives well with very reduced inequalities. But that supposes a certain number of conditions. For example, in most countries in Africa, the labor force in the agricultural sector and the prices of the labor of the peasants or the products they are selling could not be left to the market. So these are things we have to control domestically, and at the same time try to reduce the urban and rural divide. But all of this supposes another kind of macroeconomic framework, which is different from the colonial framework. And this colonial framework, for me, is more or less a neoliberal framework because they are based on many similarities. And using the monetary powers of the states is one crucial aspect of it. And a popular democratic control over existing resources is another aspect. We could also try to see how the global south could try to, like in the times of the Bandung conference, how they can position themselves to create a new set of rules that would give them more domestic space, because we could not only rely on organizations like the OECD or the G20, because we know that they are captured by the interests of global finance. So at one point, the reaction has to come from the global south.
That reference to Bandung feels like just the moment to leave this, and certainly on the tech side, a lot of energy has gone into how you move the decision making into not perhaps perfect situations at the UN, but at least something with more chance of being inclusive. I'm aware we're up against the time limit now, so let me thank you again for both a fantastic keynote and a great Q&A. Thank you very much. We've had a lot of interest in that, a lot more questions, requests for the text of your talk and your paper. We'll tweet out what we have, and of course, I should say all of this material will be available afterwards, both the video and supporting materials. But for now, we will look forward to your book coming out next year. And once again, thank you, Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla. We are very grateful.
Thank you, Max, and thank you to everybody.